Let's talk about what I would consider one of the most poorly communicated things in video games, which is choice and consequence. You often hear choice and consequence thrown around when we talk about RPGs. You're going to make a choice and everything is going to change based upon that choice. It's used as a way to indicate that what you do matters. The problem is that it can actually be quite hard to demonstrate this in the marketing of your game. If I make a choice, how are you going to show me the consequence of this choice? And you see attempts done at this from time to time as different games play around with this concept. Maybe you play through the same sequence twice to show the different states of game based upon a choice that you were making. But I would actually argue that we're kind of missing the whole point here when we are doing these demonstrations, when we are talking about choice and consequence. So let me step back and talk about this concept through a slightly different set of lenses. I would argue that instead of it being two things, choice and consequence, that we're really talking about four things: choice, reactivity, consequence, and what I'm going to call world consequence. And let me walk through what I think each of these means and give us a few examples as we go. So, choice. I, as a player, am making a choice to do something or not do something, or between two different possible actions or conversation choices or what have you. This is an interactive medium. You are making choices all the time when you're playing any game. The act of choosing to shoot your gun or not shoot your gun, that's a choice. It doesn't necessarily have to be a major choice to fit into this framework of something that impacts the way that your game plays. I mean, the most obvious is if you choose not to shoot your gun in the FPS, you're probably going to lose. But games actually do, and very effectively have, choice and consequence reacting to these relatively micro decision points. Examples of games that have choices: all games have choices. Tetris has choices. This is the basis of our medium. It's what makes us different from movies and books. Moving up from choice to reactivity, this is the game noticing that you made a choice, but not just noticing, communicating to you as a player that you have made a choice. Here you get a lot of stuff that feels like consequence, but isn't necessarily consequence. A perfect example of this for me is the Bloody Baron plot in Witcher 3. You are communicating with the Bloody Baron, and you are giving him advice, and he takes that advice, and then the next scene plays out based upon the choice that you made. But it doesn't really have any consequences to you, the player, or to the Witcher character that you are controlling. But it feels like it does. The game is very reactive to the choice that you made, and it says, hey, you made a choice. Now we're gonna do something based upon the choice that you made. But here, when we're down at reactivity, the game isn't necessarily changing in a way that affects your gameplay based upon the choice that you made. It's just communicating strongly enough for you to notice that, hey, I noticed you did a thing. That's cool. The most dismissive version of this would be you put on a different hat and the game says, hey, nice hat. Or in one of the Fable games, if you kicked a chicken, people started calling you Chicken Kicker. Didn't it affect anything else in the game? No, but it felt like the game was noticing what you're doing and responding to that. An interesting thing about reactivity is it doesn't actually have to be triggered off of a choice. It could simply be triggered off of something that you had to do, but you felt agency in doing it. So if you had to go and save the princess from the well, and later the game is responding to you doing that, if you felt ownership of that action, even if you had no choice over it, it's still going to feel like good reactivity where the game is responding to my actions. So something to keep in mind is doesn't necessarily have to trigger off of a choice I made. There can be a tendency to be too subtle when it comes to reactivity. If you are responding to a choice the player just made, you can probably get away with just reacting and moving on. But if it's been a while, then you may need to remind the player that they made that choice. Because if something just happens, in their mind, they may have collapsed the probability space and not remembered that there was a branching point 3 hours ago. So the fact that the city gets attacked by walruses, they may not connect back to the fact that you freed the walrus queen 6 hours ago. So you might need to be as blatant and deliberate as telling them, thank you for saving the walrus queen, now we shall get our revenge upon this city. Don't overestimate the memory of a player when it comes to the choices that they made. In fact, this is sort of the flip side of sometimes you get the benefit of reactivity even if there wasn't an attached choice. Sometimes you don't get the benefit of reactivity if there was a choice, if the player's forgotten that there was a choice point back there. So sometimes it's worth being pretty on the nose when you're responding to what a player did in the past, especially as you're getting beyond the 45 minutes point in terms of how long it's taking for you to react. Moving up from reactivity to consequence. When we're up at consequence, this should actually be affecting my ongoing experience of the game. A follower is dead. So now I no longer have access to this follower because they're dead, or they got mad at me and ran away. A game that actually does this really well based on injecting consequence on very micro choices is Metal Gear Solid 5. If I use lots of knockout gas, the enemies start wearing gas masks. If I'm shooting people in the head, they start wearing helmets. That game feels very much like it's paying attention to what I'm doing and pushing back on my actions. But it's not just reactivity, because my experience is materially changing based upon that reactivity. There's a consequence to the actions that I'm taking. It is responding to the gameplay choices that I'm making in a way that changes those gameplay choices going forward. In a BioWare game, good consequence is the end armies in Dragon Age Origins. I've been making choices throughout the game. The game is now giving me different gameplay in the final section of the game that is affecting the way this end part of the game plays out. So there is a consequence to my gameplay based upon what I've been doing. Consequence without enough reactivity in there can just get lost in the noise. The Templar mage choice in Dragon Age Inquisition falls into this camp. It is not actually clear to me as a player, if I'm not paying enough attention, that there is a consequence to an action that I made earlier. Partially, this is because there is too much separation between when the choice was made and when the consequence occurs. Partially, it's because the reactivity and communication of this is a thing that is reacting to what you have done isn't strong enough, isn't loud enough. This is what Fail Better Games calls card tricks in the dark. You can have the most brilliant reactivity, the most consequential consequences, but if the player doesn't notice, then you've spent an inordinate amount of time and effort and testing on something that is getting you zero benefit. It's important to do your clever stuff out in the open. Again, going back to CD Projekt actually has a tendency to be very deliberate in communicating that you did a thing, here is the consequence, drawing a very direct connection between those two things. Sometimes BioWare in the past has fallen into the trap of being a little too subtle and things get lost because players are busy. And it's not their fault that they're missing the very clever reactivity that the developers built in. It's up to the developers to play those card tricks in the light, to make sure the player understands what's going on and that what they did is being reflected back at them. And then the fourth and final thing in this collection of choice and consequence attributes is what I'm calling world consequence. This is me as a player feeling like the setting and world is materially different based upon the choices that I've made. Classic example is epilogue slides in a Dragon Age game. Different person is king, that is going to play out in different ways. The world feels materially different based upon what I have done. Arguably, this is just reactivity with a different time sequence. The game isn't actually different. My play experience isn't necessarily different. It's just that I feel like the world has been left in a new state. Historically, I would argue that Dragon Age games have done actually pretty well at reactivity and world consequence, and haven't always done as well at consequence. Because for consequence to really feel like it's there and meaningful, the game needs to change. It's easier to do reactivity and world consequence because a lot of that can live entirely within the narrative structure of the game. Whereas consequence needs to materially change the experience. But you do see games very successfully do things that are essentially just reactivity, but are feeling like consequence. This again is the Bloody Baron in Witcher 3. It feels like I made a choice and now I have to live with the consequences of my action. But actually it doesn't really matter to my game experience at all. But who cares? Feels like it had a material impact, so maybe that's even better because we were able to get the impact of a consequence with the expense and complexity of reactivity. With some of this, there is an opportunity to lean into the player's own imagination. Fail Better Games does something called Campfires in the Dark. Fallen London is driven by a bunch of different currencies, things like reputation. In order to unlock a plot, you might need to get reputation constables up to 60. When you then unlock that plot, you are going to get some narrative based upon your standing with the constables. But the player will actually fill in a lot of this reactivity themselves. If the plot is written in a clever way, it's not reacting to the specific bits of gameplay that you engaged with in order to get your reputation constables up to 60. Instead, it's just talking about you having done them some favors. If you ground the game and just did a bunch of rat hunting and slowly ground your constables up like that, you are going to react to that kind of language in one way. If on the other hand, you save the commissioner's daughter from being kidnapped, then that line is going to hit in a very different way. So it's going to feel like reactivity. It's going to feel like the game noticed what you did, when actually it absolutely didn't. You are going to react to a single line in two different ways based upon the journey you actually took. So sometimes reactivity is inside the player's mind. But you can start to see that the problem that we have with this from the perspective of making this a marketable feature. The thing that I can show is big stuff. Stuff that makes a difference. Stuff that lives in world consequence and consequence. Not really reactivity, but the stuff that I feel as a player really lives down in that reactivity. I made a decision and the game was like, yeah, you made a decision. Let me talk to you about that. But that's quite difficult for us to show. A big part of the difficulty in showing reactivity is it relies on an emotional attachment to the characters that I'm interacting with, to the situation that's going on. It requires the context of what is going on. And without that, it's just kind of like, yeah, I said a thing and then they said it back, who cares? But in the moment when you are invested in this character that is now mad at you, or if you're invested in this situation that's now gone wrong, it feels like a lot. But that makes it very difficult to demonstrate in a marketing context. While I do feel this constellation of features is something that's really important and really great for players to deepen their investment in a game, I'm increasingly unconvinced that this is a very effective thing to talk about in the marketing, because it's so difficult to show in a way that's understandable and actually, for that matter, representative of the final game. If you show a couple of your big world-changing consequences in your marketing, chances are you're showing 60 or 70% of all of those that exist. Whereas if you try to go and show your reactivity, you may find it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to actually successfully pull that off. So, choices, games are filled with choices. We're making choices all the time. But they don't matter unless there's reactivity, so that the game acknowledges those choices and reflects them back at us. And it can reflect and react to very small choices and make those choices feel much more impactful than they may have felt like in the moment. Consequence, the game is materially different because of a choice I made. The gameplay changes, the state of the current world that I'm playing within is different. And then world consequence, something that exists beyond the setting of this single game. The setting and world has changed beyond the confines of this single game. Ideally, if you are a game that is driven by characters and story, you have some of all of this in order to make the character feel like the actions that they are taking, the agency that the player has, is impacting the world and making a difference. But I do not think that this is something you should hang an entire marketing campaign on, unless you're prepared to spend a lot of time explaining and building up these concepts in your potential game buying audience. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. Also, we have a Patreon now if you are more comfortable with that. We have merchandise. This is the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie. If you're interested in picking something up, there's a shelf below this video as well. What are some of the best examples of this that you've experienced? What are some games where you've done something and then had the game acknowledge that choice and it really felt like you made a difference in the way the game was playing out? Throw a comment down below and let's talk about it. I will see you again soon. Thank you.